An ambitious pipeline is firing off a war of opinions.
Environmental activists marched in Washington today to protest plans for the Keystone XL oil pipeline.
A $7 billion project to transport 800,000 barrels of tar sands oil a day from Canada down to the Gulf Coast.
In Washington, a showdown on the Senate floor today over the Keystone XL pipeline. The vote to approve the controversial project has big political implications.
The pipeline would create 20,000 jobs, but opponents say the environmental risk is too great.
One of the touchstones of the climate change debate has been the Keystone XL pipeline. It's designed to carry oil from Canada through the United States to refineries in Louisiana and in Texas. The environmental movement has wholeheartedly rejected this deal from the beginning, to further contribute to the problems of climate change.
Pipeline.
1.
We are the people.
2.
You can't ignore us.
3.
Now, you would think that the Clintons would be opposed to the Keystone XL pipeline deal because of those concerns. And perhaps they might be, except for one or two problems, or should I say 1 or 2 million problems. You see, when Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State in late 2008, there was already an issue related to the Keystone XL pipeline sitting on her desk.
She was going to have to sign an environmental and economic impact statement and decide whether the Keystone XL pipeline should go forward. At that precise time, Bill Clinton gets a lucrative offer of nearly $2 million to give 10 speeches in Canada for the first time ever from a company called TD Bank Investment Group. He gave the last speech in May of 2011. 3 months later, Hillary's State Department releases an environmental impact statement that was seen as largely supportive of the Keystone XL pipeline in a way that was massively controversial. Hillary Clinton, in effect, was betraying the environmental movement by greenlighting this deal, when she had in her hands the power to kill this deal in its crib.
It was shocking. Organizations like Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth were stunned. They wanted investigations, but everybody was mystified. Nobody could understand why Hillary Clinton would sign off on this deal, particularly when she had been in favor of dealing with climate change, and her boss, Barack Obama, by all indications, seemed to be opposed to this deal as well.
It's also a time for a new approach to climate change. We know we've got to deal with global warming. We're seeing the effects of it. We need to invest in clean energy technology today so that we can create new high-paying jobs to protect our environment, to grow our economy, and to finally break our addiction to foreign oil.
How did we go from the Clintons being in favor of fighting climate change and dealing with fossil fuel dependence to Hillary Clinton signing off on the Keystone XL pipeline? The evidence that we found was that it was about the money. This was not a philosophical change. This was not a new way of thinking about global warming. This was a way of taking $2 million in cash to essentially buy a decision by the Secretary of State. Why is the TD Bank Investment Group so interesting? Because they just happen to be one of the largest shareholders in the Keystone XL pipeline itself.
When we looked at Bill Clinton's pattern of giving speeches, we looked at who was paying him, when they were paying him, and if they have ever paid for a speech before. What's so stunning is that TD Bank had never sponsored a speech by Bill Clinton before. And then suddenly, in late 2008, when Hillary Clinton has been announced to be the Secretary of State, and when sitting on her desk is the matter of the Keystone XL pipeline, they suddenly decide to sponsor these speeches.
And when people realized that the Clintons had pocketed about $2 million at the precise time Hillary Clinton was making this decision, it all now suddenly made sense. Because as we've seen repeated over and over and over again, when it comes to the Clintons, you have to follow the money. And in the case of the Keystone XL pipeline, they seem to have abandoned their principles, their commitment, as it was, to combating global warming and dealing with our dependence on fossil fuels. They jettisoned that when $2 million showed up and suddenly came out in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline. When you see this sort of pattern of behavior, you can't come to any other conclusion that it's a system of pay to play.
And again, other entities appear to have picked up on this business model too. Well, Bill Clinton has been paid enormous sums of money over the years to give speeches. On average, he gets a little less than $200,000 per speech. But something happened in late 2008. His speaking fees skyrocketed after he'd been out of office for years. The reason was his wife had become Secretary of State. In fact, 11 of the 13 speeches for which Bill Clinton has been paid $500,000 or more occurred precisely when Hillary was the most powerful diplomat in the world.
You will never contribute to an organization that will give you a higher probability of having your good intentions turn into real positive changes in other people's lives. That will give you a better chance than what you've done here tonight.
His single biggest speech payday came from the Swedish telecom company Ericsson, and it's a very, very unusual and troubling story.
Now, Ericsson is a Swedish telecom company that in 2009 and 2010 was in trouble with Hillary because Ericsson was selling a lot of telecom equipment to Iran, to Belarus, and to other oppressive governments, about which the State Department was concerned. Ericsson risked being put on a list by the federal government in the United States for trading with an enemy state. There was actually an effort being put forward in Washington to broaden Iranian sanctions to include the very technologies that Ericsson was selling to the Iranian government. So it's against this background
that Ericsson decided now might be a good time to hire Bill Clinton to give a speech.
They had never paid for a speech by him before, and they decided to go in big, $750,000 for a single speech. 7 days after he gave that speech, Hillary's State Department came out with a statement which said, "We are not going to broaden sanctions on Iran to include technologies like telecom. We're going to rely and expect companies like Ericsson to police themselves."
It was a massive win for Ericsson. Ericsson was able to avoid having to deal with a regulatory battle in Washington, giving up contracts that were highly lucrative in these countries, and being put on a list that would create an enormous diplomatic problem for them, all because essentially they paid Bill Clinton to give a speech for $750,000.
Will you continue to give speeches?
Oh, yeah. I got to pay our bills.
So the question is, why do we see the Clintons reversing decades of policy positions that they've held so closely on issues like human rights and environment? And a big clue comes from the folks that are giving the Clinton Foundation literally tens of millions of dollars. And one, if not the biggest donor to the foundation, is a Canadian named Frank Giustra. Giustra is in the mining business, hardly something you'd call environmentally friendly. And he has interests all over the world. And he used his relationship with the Clintons to benefit those interests, regardless of the environmental concerns. A great example of this is what happened in Colombia.
What's so interesting about the relationship that the Clintons have with Frank Giustra is they tend to show up in these foreign countries together at the same time.
Frank Giustra's made billions of dollars over the years in the so-called penny stock market in Canada, which is highly open to manipulation. He's been very successful in this area. Now, the Vancouver Stock Exchange is not like the New York Stock Exchange in the United States. This is the stock market or an exchange that is dominated by penny stocks, made up of natural resources stocks. It's sort of the wild, wild west of investing.
It's called Dodge City sometimes. And the reason is because there's a lot of speculators, there's a lot of misinformation that's put around, and there are a lot of mining companies that don't really have any assets, but will proclaim to have gotten the rights to some lucrative gold mine, let's say, and then they send that news out to the public in the hope that it will lead to a flood of people buying the penny stock so the shareholders can sell their assets. So in June of 2010, Bill Clinton and Frank Giustra fly to Bogota, Colombia. And who arrives there at roughly the same time? Secretary of State Hillary.
The big thing from the news conference was where Bill and Hillary were dining the other night in Bogota. I had a chance to talk to her about her dinner experience in the Zona Rosa, and here's what she had to say.
Dinner was good?
It was excellent in every way.
So it was like eating in the States, but eating in Bogota.
Well, it was a real treat to be in Bogota and to be with people who love this city so much, including my husband.
Now, in her memoirs, Hillary Clinton says that this is just a happy coincidence. But when you see what follows, you realize that this is no coincidence.
The following morning, Bill Clinton has a breakfast meeting with the outgoing president of Colombia, President Uribe. Then, like a tag team, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has a noon lunch meeting with him. She grants favors, including technical agreements that the Colombian government wants. In the days that follow, something dramatic happens. Frank Giustra has 3 companies that get major concessions from the Colombian government: Pacific Rubiales, Petroamerica, and Prima Colombia Properties. One of those, Prima Colombia Properties, gets a concession to cut timber in a rainforest in Colombia along the Pacific coast.
And that timber is not intended to export to the United States, but is intended for export to China. There's an outrage and upset environmentalists who realize what's going on, and eventually that permit is yanked by a future president of Colombia, but not before Frank Giustra's company is able to profit from cutting down these rainforests, which again is a behavior that runs so contrary to what the Clintons profess to be in favor of.
We all know that in order to build low-carbon economies of the future, we need sustainable forests.
I also know the future of our planet depends on healthy, standing forests.
They have talked about the problems of deforestation. They've talked about the problems of the need for successful growing forests to mitigate carbon dioxide in the air. And yet, when this commercial opportunity was presented to a major donor of theirs, they seem to be very much supportive of that and, in fact, helped to get him those concessions.
He deserves the credit for this. This was his idea, not mine, and he raised the money. And it's an astonishing achievement. My job is to make sure that it's not in vain, that he gets the return on his investment and his compassion and his commitment.
The Clintons appear to have changed their stance on issues even more significant than the environment, in ways that benefit those who have put money in their pockets.
I represent a president and a country committed to a vision of a world without nuclear weapons and to taking the concrete steps necessary that will help us.
The Indian nuclear deal, I think, is so troubling because this is a core national security issue.
One of the signature achievements in foreign policy for Bill Clinton was pushing the Test Ban Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Today in New York, the United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly to adopt the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and open it for signature later this month.
The NPT has been sort of the holy grail when it comes to nuclear disarmament, something that the Clintons have been supportive of, not just for years, but for decades.
That was all thrown asunder in 1998 when the Indian government tested
nuclear weapons underground.
India's action threatens the stability of Asia and challenges the firm international consensus to stop all nuclear testing.
These were tests that truly shocked the world. Even the CIA was not aware that these tests were about to take place. Clinton's reaction was volcanic. He felt betrayed by the Indian government. And as a result, he imposed sanctions on India, essentially saying,
you're not going to get access to U.S. nuclear technology
until you sign the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In 2005, the Indian government wanted to get these sanctions lifted.
Not only do they have an interest in expanding their civilian nuclear, they live in a neighborhood where some pretty tough customers and rivals have nuclear weapons themselves. First of all, you've got Pakistan, which is right next door, which is widely believed to have nuclear weapons. And then you have China, a longtime rival of India, which has a nuclear arsenal.
The Clintons said that they were in favor of giving the Indian government some access. But the problem is it didn't go nearly as far as the Indian government wanted. So in 2005, they started making donations to the Clinton Foundation.